Hello and ya Ali Madat, everyone. This is your host Navid Amiri coming back to you with episode 2 of the Ismaili intellectual tradition. So before we start our episode today, I just want to thank everybody who supported episode 1, who gave likes, comments, subscriptions to the channel, and who shared the channel with their family and friends. It was completely unexpected, the level of support that I got, and I really, really appreciate it. It was extremely heartwarming and encouraging and motivating for me. Um, and I have, a good feeling about the future of the channel with the kind of support that I got. So thank you so much for that. And having said that, let's jump into the topic for today, which is on reason and intellect in understanding our faith. Okay, so to begin our topic for today, we're going to start out basically by talking about what reason is and then why is it actually so difficult, right? Why do we actually have such a difficult time having an agreement on what reason is and how, and how to decide whether something is rational or not rational. And in order to basically go through this topic, we're going to be pretty heavily relying initially on a book by John Walbridge that's called God and Logic in Islam, the Caliphate of Reason. And John Walbridge basically starts out here with a definition of reason. That's one of the first parts of the book. And so in his definition of reason, there are a few terms. And in a second, we'll get to an example so I can tell you more easily or give you a more concrete example of exactly what he's talking about in this definition. But just bear with me for a second and I'll show you exactly what all of this means. So first of all, he says that the first component of reason is that it's a systematic and controlled use of beliefs, arguments, and actions. Okay, that part's pretty simple. The second part, this is where he starts using a few technical terms. So he says that any rational sort of argument or statement of reason is going to be based on sound premises and valid arguments. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. The third thing he says then is that the soundness of the premises and the validity of the arguments that you or anyone makes, it should be evident to anyone, right? If they are given that exact information, if it's communicated properly, and if they have the ability to comprehend it, they should be able to see exactly how your premises are indeed sound and how your arguments are in fact valid. And finally, assuming all of that has occurred, if the person has completely understood and you've communicated all of that properly, the person should then be able to see how any conclusions that you make based on your sound premises and your valid arguments are logical followers from that, right? So they should be able to see that whatever you conclude logically follows from the premises and from the arguments, and should be completely clear to them. And therefore, if all of that is in place, you basically have something that is rational, right? So it's rational not just to you, but it is something that when it's communicated to someone else is also seen as perfectly rational and reasonable. So now we're going to go ahead and look at an example of a very simple philosophical argument. It's going to be very, very simple. And I'm going to sort of outline exactly what we mean by premises, arguments, conclusion. We'll take a look at that a little bit. And hopefully that will help this whole thing make a lot more sense. Okay, so in order to sort of understand that entire definition of reason that I had outlined, we're going to look at something that is called the Kalam cosmological argument. So this is actually an argument or a version of an argument from the Islamic theological or Kalam tradition that was popularized by a Christian apologist, basically someone who is a defender of the Christian faith and tries to explain how the Christian faith is both rational, true, correct, and whatnot for the believers. And basically, there's a version of this Islamic argument that he has popularized in order to sort of argue for God's existence, for the idea that God's existence is logically provable. So basically, in this argument, there are three parts to it. All right, so I'll show you what those three parts are, and then we'll talk about what each of those parts actually means and sort of how that corresponds to our definition of reason. So first of all, the first part of the argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? Number two, the universe began to exist, right? So therefore it has a beginning, right? Third, therefore the universe must have a cause, okay? So very simple, like I told you, right? It's just three parts here. So now, why did I bring this up? This is where we get into the idea of what premises, argument, and conclusion refers to, okay? So if we look at this entire thing that you're looking at here, this would be, of course, an argument, right? Because I called it the Kalam cosmological argument. So the argument, in a sense, refers to this entire unit of these three statements, right, that are made. Then, when we're talking about premises are basically what are called the foundations or the basis for the argument, right? So basically, we're looking at statement number 1 and statement number 2, right? These are called premises because those are the two things on which number 3 is standing on. So number 3 is the conclusion, right? And the conclusion, logically, is true if the two premises are true. Okay, so if it is true, right, logically, that anything that begins to exist at some point has a cause, right? So it had a beginning, it wasn't always there. That's what that means. It wasn't eternal. It's something that actually had a beginning or starting point in time, in some sense. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. So if that's true, then we're saying number 2, well, the universe does have a beginning. Okay, we're saying that, well, the universe does. So if that first statement is true, and it's also true then that the universe in fact has a beginning, then the conclusion logically must be that the universe has a cause. Okay, and that would be your conclusion. So I hope that gives you a simple idea sort of what that means. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward, right? You can see how sort of logic works in this case, and you can probably see how these statements actually connect logically. So then what's the problem, right? What's the issue? Well, the problem exactly comes down to, well, even if this argument in theory makes perfect sense, we can still question the premises. Like, for example, is it really true that everything that begins, right, that had a beginning in time has to have a cause? Do we know that for sure? I don't know. Some would say yes, some would say no. Did the universe itself actually have a beginning? Some might say yes, and some actually, in fact, argue that the universe has always existed or is eternal, right? So it had no starting point. It's just simply been there, and therefore there was never any need for a cause. It's just always been there, right? So some people might disagree with that. And of course, if you have any disagreement with those premises, then naturally you can't really get to that conclusion, which is that the universe has a cause, right? So that third statement, you can only get to that if you actually agree with the first two statements. And this is exactly where you start to have an issue, because now you actually need separate arguments for these premises, right? And you have to start looking at, well, okay, how do we know those are true? Those will have arguments, but then people can question those as well. Well, how do we know, X, Y, or Z? So this is where reason starts to get really, really complicated. Because again, it really depends on whether, what you subscribe to, what your, in a sense, first principles are, right? So for some people, it's like an obvious starting point that the universe has a beginning or a cause, because maybe they believe in the Big Bang Theory, right? If they're living, in this contemporary period, they may say that, oh yeah, well, of course, we know that the universe is 14-something billion years old. This is very clear. Scientists more or less agree on this. And so, of course, the universe had a beginning, right? But again, not everybody puts the same stock in that. There's some who might say, well, I mean, the Big Bang Theory is still a theory. Nobody actually saw the whole Big Bang thing happen. Nobody was there. And so how exactly can we logically, with such certainty, make a statement like that, right? How do we actually do that? And again, about the beginning of the universe, there's a lot of debate on this. And so that's really where the problem comes in, is that, there are lots of easy ways to create logical arguments, but the problem becomes getting people to actually agree, or there actually being an actual mutual understanding of whether something actually is rational, or actually is made up of true statements for one person or another. All right. And so finally, what I want to do on this episode is introduce a little bit about the use of reason, so the history of reason in the Western tradition. Now you might be wondering, why the Western tradition? This is an Ismaili intellectual tradition channel, right? Why are we looking at the West? Well, the reason why this is important is because the West and also the Islamic world in general were both responding to the intellectual work of the Greeks. Okay, so Greek philosophy and other Greek intellectual materials were important and foundational to both civilizations, right? So of course there are a number of different factors. We can't say that the West and the Islamic world evolved or changed or were built on the exact same foundations. But Greek thought was very important to both of those foundations. And so for that reason, there's still a lot we can learn from some of the Western history of the use of reason and sort of their response to the Greek material, because this gives us a lot of information and a lot of stuff to sort of build on when we're talking about how Islam does certain similar things, but maybe in somewhat different ways. And basically when we're talking about sort of Greek literature, the main thing that I sort of want to, what I'm emphasizing, or what's sort of the biggest contribution that Greek material gives in a very general sense, is that the belief that the cosmos, right, or the universe, or creation, or however you want to put it, is inherently rationally structured. So the idea is that the entire universe has a rational pattern and structure to it, right? That everything actually can make sense, right? It actually has certain logical foundations and ways in which everything is built, right? It then, basically says, well, human beings have rational minds, right? Rational psyches, okay? So if the cosmos or the universe is structured in a rational way, and human beings have minds that are able to think rationally, therefore, see, this is a philosophical argument, just like the Kalam argument we were looking at, right? So therefore, based on those two statements, assuming that they're true, that means that the universe and its structure can be understood by the human mind, and that we can talk about and communicate about this structure of the universe using language, right? That's really the foundation or the biggest contribution that Greek wisdom basically gives in this very general sense, because the Greek tradition is very big, and of course the entire Greek tradition is not a monolith. It doesn't have they're not all the same. There are many different kinds of thinkers, many different philosophies, different kinds of arguments, different schools of thought, right? There's a lot of different things there. But that is the general thing which sort of is underneath all of that, which you could say that Greek philosophy in general believes in, right? Is that the world is, the universe is rational, our minds are rational, and therefore the human mind has the ability to understand and talk about the structure of the universe for that reason, okay? And so basically, what we're going to be looking at is a few different ways that the Western tradition, or the Western world basically responded to these ideas that they got from the Greek tradition before we eventually move on to the Islamic response. So, and for the West, we have a few models or a few movements that take place during Western history, and we'll talk about them slowly. We won't get to every single one of them in the next episode. We'll sort of break it into pieces where we might have one episode covering each one. So it'll probably be, we might have about 5 different episodes because we have these 5 different models here. The first one being scholasticism, the second one being Enlightenment rationalism, the third one being scientism, the fourth one being utilitarianism or practicalism, and then finally you have relativism. And included in that, once we get through all that, we're also going to talk about two anti-rational movements, okay? One of them being textualism or literalism, and the other being romanticism. So those words probably sound a little complicated for some people if you're not familiar with, have never heard some of those words before. Like you probably, you know what science and reason is, but what's scientism and what's rationalism, and we'll get to that. We're going to be explaining those in detail and in very simple terms. You don't have to know right away what those are, but that's basically the introduction to sort of what we're going to be talking about in the next few videos, before then moving on to sort of how that's relevant to the Islamic tradition. All right, so that concludes our first actual content episode, or the second episode of the channel in general. I hope you enjoyed this. This is sort of this is the beginning of our content, and so I'll appreciate any sort of comments, feedback, whether the content was a little too difficult, was it heavy, would you like to actually see these be longer videos? Because I'm trying to make this as accessible as possible for a pretty wide range of people, of different levels of education, and and be just as easy to follow for a philosopher sort of person versus somebody who's not really hasn't been a part of this field before, done a lot of reading in philosophy and history and things like that. And so I'm trying to have a pretty good balance here, to where we go where we don't really alienate anyone, and we really make this a very widely accessible channel for people. That's kind of why I'm going with a shorter format, and trying my best to not have the content be too overly complicated. It is going to get more complicated as we build, of course, but the idea is to have all these little pieces that are sort of taking us up to the more complicated material. But even then, of course, we're going to try to preserve this very simple tone, this very simple language, and we're going to try to avoid, being too overly technical, or talking about these things in a way that are more difficult than necessary. We don't want to sound like an academic paper, how those can be unnecessarily complicated in terms of the way their language is. So yes, so please, any feedback, any comments, anything would be helpful to making sure that this channel is something that makes as many people happy and pleased as possible. So let me know what your thoughts are and what you want to see more of. And yeah, hopefully I get a good level of support for this one, like I did the first episode. And so until then, goodbye. And I hope to see you for episode 3. Ya Ali Madad.